welcome. If you're brand new, special welcome to you. So glad that you've chosen to be with the Redeemer's family today. We hope that you enjoy your experience. Next weekend, it's the devil's time change thing. I hate that one. So I'm glad you're here this week. Also, I want to thank all of the ladies who were involved in putting on the women's worship night last night. Great job. We had over 120 ladies here, women here, Redeemers, where women can be women and men can be men, and we worship in that way, and it's awesome. You guys did a great job. Shout out to Sandy Jones for bringing a wonderful word, so great job. Okay. Guys, we've been working through the Old Testament book of Nehemiah, as Kyle and Ambrose said, and this is a biblical text. It's a historical book. It's real history about a guy who lived in the 5th century BC who was called by God to lead his people, the people of Israel, out of brokenness. Israel, in many ways in this period, was just broken by sin and war and exile, and in particular, Nehemiah, as we've learned, was sent to the city of Jerusalem. Now, the city of Jerusalem was, prior to this, the jewel of the Middle East and the ancient Middle East, teeming with life and activity, the city of God, established for God's purposes, to be a central hub where his presence could dwell and the people of God could come and worship and live and flourish, where the nations would travel and learn about Yahweh and then take the message of Yahweh and the ways of Yahweh back to their own places. And in the midst of this, of course, was Solomon's temple, the beautiful temple, and this is where God's people would worship and come to understand the scriptures and sacrifice and give their offerings to God. And it was where festivals took place. It was just an amazing situation, guys. The wall was surrounding the city, keeping the people protected and safe. They could worship freely without interference. But as we learned, all of that got broke. All of it, like completely broke. The whole of Israel was a broken nation. The system of worship, the temple itself was destroyed. Most of Jerusalem was toppled. The walls came down some 150 years prior to Nehemiah. The city, of course, was, we learned, overrun by the Babylonian army. This occurred after generations of unfaithfulness towards God, God's discipline. And so the people were scattered into exile, brokenness everywhere. This is a sad time, a low time for Israel. This is a time of discipline, a time of mourning and weeping and loss and grieving. But with the Lord, that doesn't last forever. There's always hope, even in the middle of a dark time. And so the hope comes when Nehemiah is sent. It's his time now, and God sends him to rebuild and repair and revitalize the city. And it started with the broken wall. First, you got to start with the thing that protects the thing that you really want done. Or else, if you build the thing that you want done without the protection, what good is it, right? And so in 52 days, the broken wall was rebuilt, the gates rehung, protection restored. Now, that's what we studied so far. This brings us to chapter 7. So if you do have a Bible, I invite you to turn there. Nehemiah 7, please. We're just going to read the first 6 verses today. And the thing with this chapter is that it's one of these genealogy chapters in the Bible. And it's a tough chapter to teach on. And so it's a list of names. But I think we're going to take a crack at it and pull some things out. So I'm going to give you some theology today, some history today. Stay with me because it'll all come back around. And then I'm just going to preach the lights out the last 5 minutes. That's the goal. Okay, here we go. Verses 1 through 6. Now, when the wall had been built, and this is Nehemiah talking, first person, and I had set up the doors and the gatekeepers and singers and the Levites had been appointed, I gave my brother Hananiah, and Hananiah, the governor of the castle, charge over Jerusalem. For he was more faithful and God-fearing man than many. And I said to his brother, and I said to them, let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot. And while they are still standing guard, let them shut and bar the doors. Appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, some at their guard posts and some in front of their own homes. Verse 4, the city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been rebuilt. Then my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles and the officials and the people to be enrolled by genealogy. And I found the book of genealogy of those who came up at the first, and I found written in it Verse 6, these were the people of the province who came up out of the captivity of those exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried into exile. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his town. They came with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Azariah, Ramiah, Nahamani, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispereth, Bigvai, or Big Guy, Nahum, and Benai. Not banana, Benai. So rather than try to say the rest of these names, we're going to just kind of pause. But if you do keep reading, and I recommend that you do, you're going to see that Nehemiah goes on to make a detailed accounting of, what's he saying? The Israelite people who moved back to Jerusalem. And these were those who were living now in the time of Nehemiah around Jerusalem, and it goes by clan name, and then there's a census data. There's a number of people, a head count associated with each clan. And that just goes to show that everybody counts with the Lord. He doesn't forget any of us. He knows us, each and every one. Now, first things first. Even if the wall's construction was complete, the duty of defending the city was not complete. And that's because, and it's really just logic, a wall isn't much good if you don't have a staff to be at the wall, right? In particular, the gates. The gates need 24/7 personnel to open and close them. And we read that Nehemiah kind of opens the gates late because it's security, man. Remember, if you've been with us, there's enemies all around. They've been threatening to kill him. And so he's like, all right, well, we're going to open these up. Some people think around noon. Just to make sure that there's just no funny business, and so there's restricted access just for safety. And these gates need, though, the personnel, and then they need to provide security as people enter and exit. So Nehemiah accomplishes this by assembling a security force. Here are the verses we just read. It's made up of people who are of Jerusalem who live nearby. And they're assigned to each of the 10 gates. There's 10 gates around the city wall. So that's a lot of different work teams that need to be shifts and things, yeah? And these sentinels were encouraged to pay close attention when it was their shift because they were guarding their part of the wall. They were guarding ostensibly their own families, their own businesses, their own children. And so this, once again, is brilliant leadership on Nehemiah's part. He's incentivizing good security because the folks manning the wall, staffing the gates, they're literally protecting their own wee ones and their own businesses. And so you're more apt to stay awake at night and these things and pay attention. So great leadership. So when it comes, though, to the genealogy section, I want to give you some history, and I'm just going to go for it. What I want to tell you about this list is that it isn't all of the Jewish people that were alive in the 5th century BC. Chapter 7 only includes the people who had moved back to Israelite territory, and they were once in exile away from Jerusalem in the Babylonian Empire, and they came back in 3 different migrations. If you have your message notes, you can look at this timeline. We gave you this early on. It's just a little review. You see in 539, the Babylonians swept down from the north and completely conquered the southern kingdom and destroyed Jerusalem. But then soon after, the Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, rose to power, and they conquered the Babylonians in 539. And when they did this, the Persians, they reversed Babylonian doctrine, long-standing doctrine, by allowing all of the captured peoples to repatriate their homelands. This, of course, included the Jewish people. We know that King Cyrus, the Persian king, issued a decree, and we have actual evidence of this decree in the historical record. And for the Jews, their repatriation happened in 3 different waves of migration, one in 538 BC, one in 458 BC, and one in 444 BC with Nehemiah. In total, about 50,000 Jewish people moved back into Israel, moved back into the Jerusalem area. But that wasn't all of the people, because many Jews chose to stay put, to remain scattered in the Babylonian, now Persian Empire. Are you following? Just nod, or it's okay. Yeah, okay, good, thank you. No, if you're a Bible nerd, or you like nerdy things, or you aspire to be a nerd, then this is for you. There's a name that we call this phenomenon, what I just described. And it's your first fill-in. It's called the Jewish diaspora. The Jewish diaspora. Have you heard of this word before? Yes and no. The word diaspora simply means a dispersion or a scattering of a people group who become dislodged from their homeland and then spread out into another place. Diaspora, general term, that's what it means. Sometimes diasporas happen by choice. People will choose to leave their homeland in seek of a better life, in searching for better economic opportunities. For example, we are seeing a large diaspora take place here in the United States right now, in that hundreds of thousands of Californians are leaving California in search of a better life and, quite frankly, some sanity, I think. Okay. Amen. Some of you are in this room because of that. The diaspora of Californians. 500,000 Californians moved out last year, and that's more, and that's still happening today, and this year. Okay, sometimes, though, diasporas happen by force, forced relocation. Plenty of examples in world history about this. We see this here in our text. The Babylonians forced the Israelites out of Israel. There are actually several diasporas in biblical history. If you look at like the book of Exodus, for example, you see the Jews moving out of Goshen, out of northern Egypt, and into, they were kind of forced that way. And so there's several of these. And so in our case, though, the result, as things settled out, the result was Jewish communities were established and rooted in these foreign lands. This is now the people that stayed. Many Jews didn't move back to Israel. They chose to remain in their communities in Mesopotamia, in Babylon, in Persia. Why? You would think when Cyrus, king of Persia, real guy, said, you can all move back, the Jewish people would have been like, sweet, we are out of here like last year. We are going home. And as it says, like, yes, some did. But why would those that chose to stay, why would they do that? So this is where the commentators and the theologians say really practically several reasons. One, some of them were just too old to return home. They had been in captivity for 70 plus years. Some of these wee ones that were taken at the age of 5, and so they were now in their mid 70s or early 80s, and it was just, they just couldn't do it. On the flip side, there were some families that had young kids, also couldn't make the journey, so they chose to stay put. Speaking of the journey, it was very unsafe to travel at this point in time, and in many cases, this is a 1,000-mile journey, and so many people who could travel, they just said, no, we don't want to take the risk. Another reason is some of the Jewish folks had actually begun to root and prosper in Babylon, and they had they just didn't want to restart their lives. They had businesses, they had community, they had a life. It had been 7 decades and multiple generations, and they just didn't want to go back. And those that were in this situation, they had done a lot of work, many of them, to establish synagogues, synagogue life, local houses of worship where they could continue to read and study the scriptures. They could continue to worship as a community. They could continue to do many of the festivals and traditions. Not all. Obviously, they couldn't sacrifice at the temple because they didn't have a temple. There was one temple, and they couldn't do that. But many of their religious activities and their parish life was very vibrant. So that incentivized them to stay. Now, what happened to these Jewish people who remained behind is covered in detail in another book of the Bible, and that is in the Old Testament, the book of Esther. The book of Esther talks about, it's a beautiful book. In fact, one day I think maybe we'll do that as a sermon series. That'll be fun. And we can study the richness of that history and the richness of that application to our lives. But, we'll get there. One at a time. So what's interesting to me, though, okay, back to Nehemiah, is that Okay, there's this big stuff, right? Big waves, big concepts. There's diaspora, there's the migrations back, there's those that stayed behind. And what's interesting to me is all of this activity, every bit of it, was the root of brokenness. It was triggered by sin and faithlessness and the inconstancy of the Israelites towards Yahweh. And yet, God somehow takes all of this rebellion and works it into his sovereign plan. And he does so in a way that is actually kind of mind-blowing. Ultimately, the Lord was working to not only reestablish Israel so that he could draw out his son, the Messiah, from that people, but he was also working in the other outlying areas to provide a framework for the evangelism of the first and second century church to reach the world with the gospel. He was doing all of this at the same time. So Nehemiah, in a big way here, and we see this in 7, is one of these books that teach us how God uses everything for his purposes and his plans, weaving the fibers of human choice and decision, even sinful choices. He weaves those fibers into his tapestry. Do you believe that this is the thing that God does? Do you know this? Bad stuff God uses. Now, here's some theology. The Christian theologians call what I just described, they call this the left hand of God. This is your next fill-in. This is a theological concept describing how God nevertheless fulfills his divine plans despite sinful behavior, despite brokenness, despite human rebellion. This is fascinating. So it's a metaphorical term. Let me explain it. It's based on the idea that in the Bible, most people are right-handed. So right-handed people, raise your right hand. Raise your right. Left-handed people, raise your left hand. It's a few of you. Okay, so you are God's blessed. All right, you lefties. All right. So what's good is, in the Bible, the Lord does not, there's no prejudice against left-handed people. In fact, there's a couple of lefties in there that are real heroes. So all you southpaws can, I don't know, give each other a southpaw high five or something. I don't know. But here's how what this means. God's original plan, let's just call it his right-hand plan, is a plan that never involved sin and brokenness. It was a plan that was his intent for humans. But then what happens? Sin comes in the picture, lust, poverty, greed, brokenness. And because the non-ideal is now the situation, God takes over on his left hand, so to speak, and he still works his plans and his purposes. So right hand is the ideal, left hand is the non-ideal, right hand perfect conditions, left hand sinful conditions. Both sides, God's will is done. Are you with me? Example, Joseph in the book of Genesis, and go back to the first book of the Bible. Remember Joseph, okay? He's a little twerp, all right, at the beginning. He's a younger brother, and he's daddy's favorite, and he kind of rubs it in all of his older brothers, and he's a little twit, and his dad's just kind of openly favorite, and so his brothers are annoyed at him, and so eventually, though, he pushes his brothers too far, and they just snap. I mean, they fall off a shelf, and they want to murder him, and one of the brothers is like, well, maybe we shouldn't murder our little brother, and instead they sell him into slavery, and they do this secretly, and then they tell daddy that Joseph croakered by a lion or something, and they make up a story. So Joseph's out of the picture, and you think, okay, all that's really bad. That is not God's will. And yet, through that circumstance, the Lord raises up Joseph and eventually makes him the second person in charge of the most powerful country in the world, Egypt. And from that position of power, God uses Joseph to save not only the family, but save the nation of Egypt and everybody alive from a hideous famine that was taking place. And it's just crazy how God can just work all this out. And then in one of the most treasured verses in the Bible, it's at the end of Genesis, right? Joseph is with his brothers and his identity is revealed and they're all looking at each other going, what in the world is happening here? And he turns to his brothers and says this, as for you, you meant evil against me. Joseph talking to his brothers, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Left hand of God. You see this? It was not God's will to get sold into slavery. So the course of his life, theologically speaking, at some point moved from God's right hand to God's left hand. God still works out his purposes to his glory. Christy and I have a friend. She's a Christian author, a women's ministry leader. She's written many books. She tells her story of getting saved in the Jesus movement in Orange County. There's a movie about this right now. Pretty cool thing, yeah? Chuck Smith, Calvary Chapel, Jesus movement, all those hippies, all those surfer hippies who came to Christ. All right, she was one of them. Pastor Chuck Smith discipled her personally in a group. She eventually gets married to one of the other leaders in this group, and they send her and her husband to Bakersfield to start Calvary Chapel Bakersfield. But when they get there, it's discovered that her husband was abusing her in a bad way. And, well, it's always bad, but in a really bad way. And she gets a divorce. She gets a divorce. Terrible. Nobody wanted that. God, that's not God's will. It's not God's will. A lot of pain, a lot of brokenness. Pastor Chuck and the Calvary leaders take care of our friend, and she eventually goes on to marry a wonderful man of God. I know him. He is a gem. And now she writes books and speaks to thousands of women ministering God's love and grace. Left hand of God. It's a beautiful thing. Some of us here today have gone through the pain of divorce. You know this story. You've lived this story, a version of it. Or there's other things, abuse, poverty, addiction, loss. And I'm just here to tell you, in case you didn't know, that's not God's will for your life. God didn't want you to be abused. That's not his intention for you. He loves you. But it happened. It happened. And yet God still is in control, and he still somehow turns that for good. He's the only one that can bring about something good. There's another verse on this in the New Testament. You may have memorized it, Romans 8:28. Do you know this verse? And it starts out and says, and we know. And we know. We know this. We know what is about to be said. And we know for those who love God, just the good things work out together for God's glory, for good. Oh, no. No. We know that for those who love God, how many things? All things. All things. All things. Everybody say all things again. Just do it again for me. And then one more time. Work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. My question to you then, in light of this, in Nehemiah and in Romans and in Genesis and in your life, is what left hand of God's stories are operating right now in your life? I mean, my whole life is like left hand of God pathway, right? It's just absolutely how God works. How is God taking a sinful choice or rebelliousness or a wrong done to you? How is he playing that out in his sovereign hand to see his kingdom be brought forward, to see your heart healed, to see good come from this? For some of you, it's like, that's a good question, but it's like, that's too early to tell. I'm in the middle of the brokenness right now. I can't see that. I understand that. If that's you, this is not meant to bring any type of discouragement. I just would encourage you instead to keep trusting, keep hanging on to the left hand of the Lord. Because one of the great things about leaning into this truth is that even when you're in the middle of it and you begin to see like Romans 8:28 and Genesis 50:20 and you see the left hand of God, you start to lift your eyes out of the darkness and the problem and onto, okay, searching for what God is doing. And that's a good thing, because he is up to something. Okay, one last thing on this section in 7 is that God will use the scattering of his people for good things. It wasn't a good thing, the Babylonian diaspora, but God will use it for good. So how? Fast forward, if you will, 500 years in history. Just timeline it with me. We're now in the New Testament, and we're now in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, in the beginning of the book of Acts, the church is growing and growing and growing. Jesus has ascended into heaven, and the Holy Spirit has come into the leadership. And I mean, it's just people are coming to Christ in waves, and it's just amazing. Thousands and thousands and thousands. The church is growing. But in Acts 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and even 7, the church, it's just right around Jerusalem. It's right around where Nehemiah was. It's in Judea, but it's really isolated. It's concentrated. But then in chapter 7, there's a diaspora. A mini diaspora happens, and it comes in the form of a guy, one of the church leaders, a young leader, super good preacher named Stephen. Stephen is just doing his thing. He's killing it. I mean, he's ministering miracles. It's awesome. And then the Jewish leaders get jealous. They haul him into court and they charge him with heresy. And so he's in this kangaroo court, and it's this thing, and he's just all by himself, and he stands up in his own defense, and he preaches one of the best sermons that has ever been preached in the history of sermons. And at the end of his sermon, he's coming to an end in his defense, and he looks up, the scriptures say, and he sees Jesus. Jesus shows up, and Jesus stands up, doesn't stop. He gets stoned to death, but Jesus is with him in this brokenness. First martyr in Christianity, we think. It's powerful. Jesus is going to use this because right after this in chapter 8, it says this. It says, there arose a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they, the disciples, the Christians, were all scattered. They diasporaed throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. The Christians were running for their lives. They had to leave. This was a forced diaspora. And it's precisely here, from the ashes of this terrible crime and unjust martyrdom, that God uses that brokenness. How? As a way to export the gospel to others that would never have heard the gospel, because now the Christians are forced to leave and get out. And now wherever the Christians go, they take the gospel with them. And the gospel began for the first time to make its way out of Judea. The first place is it's starting to go, and eventually to the whole world. And it does so, it's triggered by a scattering and by a tragedy. And it says, let me just read this real quick. It says in verse 4 of chapter 8 of Acts, now those who scattered went about preaching the word. And it's this thing that Christians do wherever we go, we end up inviting somebody to church or praying for them, or your neighbor, and you're just like, pretty soon they're in a Bible study and you're preaching Jesus and you're sharing your testimony. This is what happens when Christians go. Have you ever felt like your life, God kicked you out of a nest and you're just like, what is the Lord doing? I wanted to stay here. I was comfortable, and yet God scattered you maybe in just a mini scattering, and you're just like, what's going on? And then later you realize, it was because my new friend at my new job needed to hear Jesus, and I was there for that. Has that ever happened to anybody here? This is going on for 2,000 years. Right? And this is how God uses scatterings, and he uses these negative things. Okay, that's not in my notes. When this scattering took place, it just never stopped. And then we read in the book of Acts how the Christians began to really take mission seriously. They did before, but now they were just kicking into high gear. And they're going not just in Samaria, which is just north of Jerusalem geographically. Now they're going all over. They're going into northern Africa. They're going in the Mediterranean Rim and modern day Turkey and modern day Greece and modern day Rome and modern day Spain. And you see this. And here's the dealio. Wherever the Christians went into a new village, the first place they went was the synagogue. How did the synagogue get there? Do you see this? Do you see how this ties in? Some of you are like, I don't know. How did the synagogue get there? Okay, the synagogue got there, some of them at least, from the Babylonian scattering and the Jews that didn't come back. And they established those synagogues. And the Christians would go into the synagogue, they would preach the gospel, some Jewish people would get saved, and then a church would be established, and then the Roman people would get saved, and the gospel began to spread. And it's God using all these scatterings and all of these pieces in this tapestry to bring about the spread of the gospel, the salvation of those who would never have heard about Christ. And we see God masterfully being, what God does is being sovereign. He's sovereign and he's smart and he figured this out and he uses it all. God working in his way to using broken situations and broken walls and broken people to bring about his good work to the world, the gospel. Okay, so this sermon is basically done, but I have one more point. Can I just do this real quick? One person said yes, so that is my permission. No, a bunch of them said thank you. Okay, I want to point out let's go back to the verse. Let me just point out one important thing. This verse, Nehemiah 7, verse 5. Then God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles and the officials and the people to be enrolled by genealogy. So I want you to focus on this phrase, God put it into my heart. God put it into my heart. Nehemiah, this is first person. Nehemiah says, what did God put in his heart? God put a desire, in this case, in Nehemiah's heart to see something done, to see something fixed. And in this case, the Jerusalem proper was pretty vacant. I mean, had been destroyed. It said the houses hadn't been rebuilt and it needed people. What good is a city without people? A city without people that's a jacked up thing. And so Nehemiah's burden is for the people of God to move back into Jerusalem and then flourish again. And so he starts organizing a census and a repopulation program. And later we're going to learn that each surrounding village that had Jewish people living in it, but not in Jerusalem, but in the surrounding areas, they had to tithe people to move back into Jerusalem. They had to 10%. He's like, who's your 10% going to be? And they tithed people back into the city to repopulate. It's unbelievable. It's really interesting how he did this. So, okay, that's the situation. But the broader point and the question that I want to ask you is this. What does God put in your heart to do, to fix, to rebuild, or build? What does God place in your heart that you just can't seem to shake? Now, sub-question. Have you ever sensed something that the Lord was doing in your heart, like a certain task, ministry, or just go talk to this person, or go be, just, it could be anything, and you're just like, I can't shake it, and it's there, and you try to stuff it, and it's like there, and it's like, eventually you're just like, well, this must be God, right? Has that ever happened to you? It can be any type of a burden. It can be a burden, a big one, like to build a business, or start a nonprofit, or to start a church, or build a ministry, or it can be a small one, like just a burden for your kid, or a burden for a particular neighbor, or just something. Burdens take all shapes and sizes. But the question is, what is your heart burdened for? Do you even have one? Is it something for your family? Is it something for Redeemers? Has God put something in your heart and you've been pushing it off and stuffing it and ignoring it? And this is how God works, guys. God does this. It's not just for Nehemiah and the superstars. God does this for his people. He will put desires in his people's heart for some type of purposeful activity in the kingdom. And this is what it is. It starts at the heart. Okay, so with God, it starts in the heart. This is how God operates in general. Would you say that? Could we put that on the screen, the next one? With God, it starts in the heart. Could you say that with me? 1, 2, 3. With God, it starts in the heart. Before God's will is done, first there's got to be a burden in somebody's heart. Let's broaden this application. Before the Christian life is lived, don't live like a Christian unless you've been regenerated in your heart by Jesus. You can't live the moral Christian life, or you can try, but it's a mess. Because you're empowered by the Spirit of God who lives in your heart. It's a regenerated heart from Jesus because God starts in the heart. He starts on the inside and works his way outward. Another example, before God puts a man and a woman together in marriage, guess what? It starts in the heart. Love starts in the heart. It should anyway. Before Redeemers Fellowship was planted, this is controversial, in either 1983 or 1984, we don't know. It's a lot of debate. Before that happened in whatever year, a dream started in the hearts of some people in Eugene and some people that lived in Roseburg. It was a burden to start a church. Some of you, there were some people in the last service that were part of that. It was cool. And they corrected me. They had a view on when it was done. It was really funny. It's adorable, actually. Before any businesses started, it starts in the heart of the founders. It's a dream. There's a burden. There's a need that's going unfulfilled that you recognize and you can't shake it. There's another example. Have you ever tried, okay? Have you ever tried this? Don't do this, but have you ever tried to convince someone that they need to go see a therapist? And you're just like, you know it, and you're probably right. You know it, and you're just like, you need to go. I'll go with you. And then if you go with them and you end up doing most of the therapy and they're just sitting there going like, I don't want to be here. This is really stupid, right? All right. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because to get healthy, a person has to see it for themselves because it has to start in their heart, not your heart. And so we see this in Nehemiah multiple times. We see him talking about things that the Lord is putting in his heart. We just read it in verse 5. It's another time in verse 15 of chapter 2. We read this a couple weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago now. He says this, then I arose in the night, this is Nehemiah, and a few men with me, and I told no one what does it say? God put in my heart to do. So God will work on our hearts. This is how it works. You're just living your life as a Christian. You're just like, man, my life is great. And I'm going to Bible study and I'm going to church and, and I'm on a serve team and you're just doing things. And then all of a sudden, innocently, the Lord will mess with you. He will put something in your heart. And you're just like, what? I didn't sign up for this. I didn't ask to be given this. What are you doing? And so you just, Lord, what are you doing? And you just try to ignore it. Oh, that's just my flesh, or that's just my own, whatever. And then God, through prayer and through discernment and through the Spirit working in you, it's just like, no, that is him. Has that ever happened to you? Me too. My life is a series of that. So here's the thing though, guys, many Christians live their whole lives and they get so busy and distracted that they never stop and they never listen to what the Lord is doing and saying and prompting them to do. Here's the thing about Nehemiah is we need to imitate him because he stopped and he listened to what the Lord was telling him to do in his heart. My question is, what's in your heart? What does God put in your heart? What does he burden you to do? What dream has he put in your heart that is from him? And it's not your own, stuff. It's not your own just kind of crazy stuff. The burrito you had last, it's him. What has God put in your heart? Some of you are like, I don't know. I didn't even know this was a thing. I'm glad you're here. Now, here's the thing. Then this is a dangerous sermon for you because once God puts something in your heart and you really listen and you're like Nehemiah, not only you listen, but you obey. Man, that's when the thing gets really fun. And you start moving to Jerusalem and building a wall and just doing stuff. And God's working through you. So that's my prayer for you. Will you pray with me as we close out today's time? So, Lord, just bow your heads, please. So, Lord, we thank you for your scriptures once again. And, Lord, these big things that we're seeing here in Nehemiah about how you work your sovereign plan. I'm praying that theological truth would settle in and even help some people reorganize some stuff, maybe untie some knots. Lord, help us to see the left hand of God at work. And even the scatterings part, Lord, there's people here that are away from family and this is a foreign place and it feels a bit like they've been dislodged. And I'm praying, Lord, for those folks that you would reveal your purposes, your bigger purposes in due course. And then, of course, Lord, what we just learned about you putting some really important things into Nehemiah's heart, and he had a heart for God to listen. I'm praying that each and every one of us would be that. Lord, that would be our story. Even if it's 10 years from now, those who've heard this message and run with it, they'll be in a coffee shop somewhere, I don't know, in Utah or some random place, and they'll be like, yeah, God put in my heart, and they'll be sharing with someone, and they're living it out. I'm praying for that. And I just ask you, Lord, to just give us your godly burdens and then give us the grace and the courage to listen. Lord, we love you. We thank you that it starts in the heart. If there's anybody here that hasn't invited Jesus into their heart to begin with, I'm praying, Lord, they would today. Lord, I thank you that you regenerate us from the inside. That's the power of the gospel. Lord, I pray that the gospel would just root itself in each and every one of our hearts, and we would live a life for you. Lord, we love you and we thank you. We thank you for Nehemiah. Help us to be like him. And we ask all these things in your name. Amen.